Unexpected study finds dozens of coastal high-rises in Miami-Dade are sinking. Does this mean that this is really bad for the buildings and that we should all be scared?
I think people are quick to call out journalists when they make a mistake or something like that, but it is, at least for me, like it's something that I take very seriously.
These buildings are 30% or more over-engineered. This warrants further study.
Right. There's a lot of good data out there. What we do is so specific that sometimes it doesn't exist, so we maybe have to do it, we have to do it ourselves.
Old buildings becoming too expensive to maintain, and then insurance compounds because they get even more expensive to maintain.
Right.
And as they get older, they become a higher risk, and therefore the insurance companies hike the rates even up higher.
With the headline, we're trying to convey that it's serious.
Here we go. This is the Better Decisions podcast, and this episode I am prepared for. Today I'm sitting here with, I'm going to try and pronounce your name without butchering it because I always sometimes get these wrong, but Katherine Kallergis.
Kallergis.
See, I completely messed that up. Katherine, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted you in today. Katherine's, for those who don't know, you are you're the editor and a journalist at The Real Deal. Correct me if I'm getting your title.
Okay, so I'm a senior reporter.
Senior reporter.
And I'm kind of in charge of the residential beat. So I work with our reporters across markets on the residential beat.
And this is with The Real Deal.
The Real Deal.
And for those who don't know, just highlight. I know this sounds kind of mundane, but for those, so we can really frame this properly, what is The Real Deal?
So The Real Deal covers the real estate industry. We're a news publication. We are in Miami, New York, Texas, California, Chicago, and we also pick up stories in other markets. And we're just, we're a news publication. So we cover everything that's going on that's important and everything that real estate touches. So politics, transportation, climate change, things like that.
And you're probably when it comes to residential real estate, actually commercial as well, you are like the go-to news source. Almost all real estate agents that I know and brokers and even the general public, when they want information about what's going on in the real estate market, you're pretty much like the go-to source because that's your focus. That's all you do. I mean, I know they'll get it from other news sources, whether it's the Miami Herald or they get it from Wall Street Journal, but that's what you do. You're not covering anything else.
That's it. Yeah. So day to day.
The day-to-day of real estate. So, and then obviously on top of it, as a senior reporter, you've also won awards from NARI and the Society of Professional Journalism, reports on the South Florida market. And you've done this for, how many years have you been with The Real Deal?
10 years.
So you've been reporting and doing this for 10 years. Okay. And that's kind of relevant because there's a changing behavior out there in the market that we'll kind of get into. But this podcast is going to revolve around a story that has come out in the last few weeks, and it's circulated around the internet. It's really kind of like got some traction and exploded. And the title is The Unexpected Study Finds Dozens of Coastal High-Rises in Miami-Dade Are Sinking.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a picture of some buildings with some sand around, and they're kind of like going down, and it's pretty scary stuff. For those that don't know, and anybody who's been living under a rock and isn't aware of this, can you just kind of highlight what the story goes into, what the study goes into?
So the study found that, I think it's a University of Miami study. They worked with researchers at other universities to track the rate at which buildings along the coast were subsiding, which is like in common terms would be like slowly sinking. And they used like points of reference to track this. So it was satellite imagery. So they were looking at like balconies and AC units and things like that to kind of see over a period of 7 years, how far and if these buildings were sinking, so to speak.
And that study was done between 2000. It was the 7 years between 2017 and 2023, or 2015.
2016. Yeah.
2016 to 2023.
Yeah.
And it was, a lot of it was buildings that were built post 2014. There was a good number in there.
If you look at the coast, yeah.
Yeah, that were, and the article again highlights there was a focus on Sunny Isles, Bar Harbor, Surfside, and that was kind of like the main key areas. It was kind of above Miami Beach.
The highest rate of
subsidence,
is in Sunny Isles.
Yeah. And the obviously it touches on a lot of things. Interestingly enough, the title of it is Unexpected, and then as you go into it, because it's a scary headline. I mean, you read the headline, but within a few sentences, the researchers in the process, the writers of the report of the University of Miami said, okay, yes, but does this mean that this is really bad for the buildings and that we should all be scared? Actually, no.
Right.
It's not that scary. So the story softens quite considerably. And it gets into, and the research itself, and I've actually got a copy of the report, and it's pretty hefty stuff. I mean, if you look at it, there's a good, what have I got here, 20 pages on this on this research. And it kind of goes into, and it goes into quite a good bit of geology. So, I don't say it's light reading. It's interesting reading. It's not super heavy, but it's not super light either.
Right.
And, it talks about the fact that Miami sits on limestone. In fact, South Florida, and there's a big map, and the yellow in the map shows almost like the whole of Florida, which is, it's not surprising because it's limestone. But it's limestone, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's limestone with sand layers intermittently dispersed through it. And it accounts that due to when we have construction, there's vibration, and that creates, I guess, molecular shifts between the sand particles, and that creates subsidence. I guess the big question it comes through, and there's several things it raises, is how normal this is.
Right.
Because the key thing that it comes into is unexpected.
Right.
So unexpected by whom? I guess unexpected by the researchers who did this. When it got into it, and I know that Kobe Karp's had a comment on this. I actually spoke to Chad Moss yesterday on this, and I said, is this surprising? And he said, this isn't surprising at all. In fact, when we engineer the buildings, we over-engineer them. These are his words, not mine.
Right.
As I try to do this, I'm coming out without a dog in the fight.
Right?
Yeah, full disclaimer. I'm just trying to look at all the sides on this. He said that these buildings are 30% or more over-engineered. So when they bring in the civil engineers, they do multiple soil samples. When they're going down with the way the buildings are built, they have these rods that go into the earth.
Piles, yeah.
The piles. And these piles go down hundreds of feet. And they are, the depth or the length of these piles, if your pen was a pile, for example, is determined by the height of the building, the weight of the building, and all of it.
The taller it is, the further you go.
Yeah. So if you have a 70-story building, an 80-story building, it's going to have much deeper piles than you would have on an 8-story building.
Mm-hmm.
Seems reasonable. Seems normal. I mean, that's what civil engineers obviously calculate, and that's their area. How deep you go, it's down to them to calculate, but they do so to factor in the risk. And they obviously have safety engineers, and they have a lot of variables to consider what would create risk. And obviously in the end they state, okay, so we see sinkage between 2 and 8 centimeters, which is between 1 to 3 inches.
I think it's less than an inch.
Yeah, less to an inch too. I think the most they were talking about over that period of time was 3 inches. The question is, and I guess as I was reading this, is how alarming is this? Because the initial headline reads like, it's the first immediate reaction for the market is, this is some scary shit.
Right. I think like with the headline, we're trying to convey that it's serious, right?
Yep.
But the word unexpected is from the study, and it's intentional because it's not like it's not extremely alarmist, right? It's like unexpected. It's not like
it's not super damning.
The word dangerous. It's not the word like buildings are going to collapse immediately. You know what I mean? So I think the reason that it's notable and the reason that the study was put out was because the rate of these buildings, subsiding was continued for years after than what everybody expected. So like when a building is completed, it's known that it shifts. Like it shifts in the first few years.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think what was interesting is that this continued to happen with a lot of these buildings, and that's what scientists found to be unexpected.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And well, when we go through it, maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into that.
Was that a pun? Or?
It is actually, it's a subconscious pun. I didn't mean to say that, but thank you for that. See, my subconscious is much smarter than my conscious mind. I've just realized that. So the depth of going down and realizing the shift, this 1 to 3 inches, when you look at I guess, what the engineers would say. The engineers and again, the builders have said, actually, you shouldn't have been surprised. You shouldn't. You were, but you shouldn't, because if you'd asked us, we'd tell you that this is totally fine and totally normal. The initial subsidence that exists, you all expect buildings to sink. And again, there's many examples of, like, if I held up a piece of paper and I was to balance your bottle on there, guess what's going to happen, right? That's going to soften down. Okay. Is it going to break the soil and shift down like that? Or is the soil going to just soften down? And the first, it's hundreds of thousands of tons of weight on the soil. Of course, it's going to create an indentation. If I lie on my bed every night and I'm 190 pounds, guess what? I'm going to make an indentation too.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that I'm also going to sink through my floor into my kitchen.
Right.
It just means that that's just gravity, right? It's physics. But then I guess, it did decelerate. The report did say after a few years, we see that the rate of subsidence actually does drop off. The question is, will it continue? And I think that's where they say on the report, this warrants further study.
Right.
Which makes sense. Which I think is responsible, and I think that's a responsible comment, because they do say, they used, and we talked about what they used to do this. They used this term, and again, I don't know if I even say this right, but interferometric synthetic aperture radar, INSAR they call it, which is a I guess a satellite way of looking at the buildings and the soil and understanding what's happening to see it indent, right? That's complicated stuff. I challenge anyone to kind of figure that out and really explain it properly. I think you need a real scientist to get into that. But as it's the first research of its kind, the first report of its kind, which I think is wonderful to see that they now have these incredible technologies that can do this. And I'm sure as we go through years, they're going to improve on that. I've had conversations with Chad Moss, who's already using AI to develop systems to improve and perfect their construction process, to streamline things. And I think as we get better at measuring things, we'll get a better answer of how things will, how they'll shake out. But I think at the end, the first initial report, because this is new, this is like fresh out of the box stuff, it obviously gets everyone's attention because no one's ever really addressed anything like this before.
Well, and our skyline has changed so dramatically over over recent years, over the past decade, that I think people have these questions, and this is a starting point.
Yeah, for sure. The buildings now, you've reported, how many buildings have you, over your 10 years, and you've looked at and reported on? You must have covered dozens and dozens and dozens of story of buildings. And the skyline 10 years ago, and you'll see that it's inherently changed. And the one thing that obviously you'll notice is that buildings are getting taller. We have so many more taller buildings that are, really at heights we've never seen before. We've also actually seen a change in behavior of those buildings as well, because now we're seeing structurally, we've got lots of tall buildings, but we're also actually, surprisingly enough, seeing a lot of what I call lower level buildings coming out as well, but they're thicker and wider and fatter and less pinpointy. So if you go to New York City, you have lots of really tall, thin skyscrapers, like 220 Central Park West. All the buildings around Central Park, they're really, really tall buildings, 100-story buildings. You go to Dubai, you see huge buildings. And now actually what we're seeing in Miami is we see this move towards primary living. We're seeing a lot of buildings coming up that are being built, which aren't super, super tall buildings. They're more like houses in the sky. So it's interesting to see, but it's the footprint. On the study, there was a couple of, I'm not going to name the names of the buildings, right? Just read the article and read into it. And if you want to, we'll add the report, we'll add the entire report onto the blog that's attached to this podcast. So if you have the willingness to read it, which I believe you should, because I think responsible journalism is what you do.
Right.
I also think there has to be a responsibility to the consumer to read information effectively and accurately, because I'm finding that there's a lack of responsibility socially with what people read and regurgitate. They read a headline, they tell Chinese whispers, and then next thing you know, the story comes around full circle, and it's crazy.
They may not even read the headline fully. So
they read 3 words. They're monosyllabic.
On social media, they don't even read the caption. So,
And that I mean that's going to get into. There's a whole. This to me was like an example of a story that comes out, and it kind of shines a light on what we're dealing with socially and what you're dealing with as a journalist in a world that we live in, where people aren't reading properly anymore. You know, they're not reading articles fully. They're not even reading headlines fully. They're scrolling visual. It's kind of mind blowing. But the story, was there anything that when you reported on this story that as you were going into it surprised you? You were like, oh, did you immediately recognize that when you got hold of this? How did the story come to you? How did this happen?
So the Miami Herald reported on the report first, and that's what I read. That's what I saw. And so I looked for the report, which was online. And I read it. And obviously, like, we as journalists, like, we're often not experts in one thing. We have to kind of learn a lot of different things through our reporting. So we're not.
They didn't send you to geology school for 4 years in geography and ask you to get your PhD before you write the article?
No. So, I mean, you read, there was actually a press release about it. So I read the press release. I looked through the report. You reach out to the authors of the report because they can explain it best. And that's so I got to speak to one of the co-authors.
You've spoken to him directly. How did that conversation go? Like, what was I'm trying to be a fly on the wall during that dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, generally what I asked was, what are the most significant takeaways that you got from this report? How did you, do your research? So that's when they talked about, obviously, like the satellite images and tracking it. And he mentioned just that it's not a cause for immediate alarm. And I think it's because it is so.
And you were very good to put that out at the beginning. Like, you almost put that out immediately. This is not cool. Just so you know, I don't want people like tearing their shirts off and running into the street screaming.
People live in these buildings, and this community went through the Surfside condo collapse where 98 people died. And so you have to be very careful in how you report on all this because it has immediate consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really does. I think responsible journalism, and it's great that you clearly view that you are really impacting people's lives. People will read this and they will act on it. This isn't arbitrary information that someone goes, all right, fine, I'm off for a coffee now and I'll get on with my life. People will make decisions based off what happens and what they read. And if this goes around, obviously it grows velocity. You mentioned the Chaplin Tower collapse, which we all agree was an absolute tragedy. And the report says that for the Chaplin Tower, we did not find any evidence of precursory displacement prior to the 2021 collapse, but the results are inconclusive because the section of the structure where the collapse initiated cannot be imaged from space. End quote. That's out from the actual report. So, this is something, and it's interesting because you wrote that, and we'll get into the follow-up dialogue that's coming out and circulating around the internet. There are people who are not being, let's say, managed or scrutinized or even held accountable or can be held accountable, will then say, condos collapsing, and they will mention Chaplin Tower, but they'll mention it in a way where it suggests there's an involvement and there's a direct correlation and that it's all part of one of the same problem, which I think is extremely dangerous. But again, look, trolls exist online. The problem is that these people have a voice, and there are a lot of people who will listen to this, read this, watch this, and they will take it to heart. So it kind of gets into that space where you're like, all right, how do you navigate that?
Right.
So you went through that. Was there anything that you, as you've listened and you've chatted, that you've said, oh, is there a follow-up story for this? Is there something that you see coming?
I mean, I think definitely, because people don't know, right, the long-term implications and what kinds of additional studies will be done. There's also the local governments who, that have questions and want to make sure that their, residents are safe. So, like, I know Surfside is going to be taking it up at a commission meeting to discuss, what is there anything that we can be doing more of or things like that. But absolutely, there's follow-ups. I think that, the fact that there is so much construction planned and so much of it is more of these buildings that are very heavy and very tall.
Yep.
I mean, there's a few super talls planned just in downtown Miami. I think they're like over 1,000 feet tall. So,
Yep.
there will be more reporting on it. And even with the collapse, even though the collapse happened in 2021, like we continue to report on it because the findings of what actually caused it have yet to be finalized. So, yeah, there's definitely follow-ups.
Do you imagine that there'll be more rigorous and more complete and more transparent research done by these developers as they're going through? Normally, people wouldn't say to a developer, can you show me your civil engineering findings or your soil sample findings or your, drill findings as you look to put these piles down? Like people who will become like amateur geologists to ask them, how does this work?
Well, don't you find with buyers that they're more informed and have more questions now?
Well, yeah, they're way more savvy and they're asking far more detailed questions. And I applaud that. I'm open to that. I always say, bring it on. Bring me your questions, because I think that, there are some fantastic developers out here in Miami. I also think there's some really terrible developers. I'm not going to say who they are because I don't want to get sued. And I've said that 1,000 times before. But I do think there are some amazing developers. And I think that you have to be careful. And it happens all too often. The baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. Like it's like a classroom of kids. There's a few badly behaved kids who aren't listening, who aren't doing what they're supposed to do, and they're not being completely honest, and they're mucking around at the back of the room. And then there's a bunch of like grade A students who are sitting at the front, paying attention and following the course of what the teacher's teaching. And that's just life. I mean, that's life in general. But I think that especially now when people see things like this, they will and that's what we have around the country. Everyone likes to throw stones at Florida. It's like the easiest glass house in the room. And of course, there'll be like developers, like plural, everyone, all encompassing, are building buildings that will sink into the ground. Well, no, there's always a case of subsidence for that happens. There's a measured amount, there's a quantifiable amount, there's an amount that's okay, there's an amount that's been calculated for. Then there are maybe instances of things that weren't anticipated. And this is where I guess that comment, the unanticipated results that need addressing. Right now, we just don't know what's anticipated, what's not anticipated.
Right.
What's expected, what's not unexpected.
But also one thing that's interesting too is that nobody was tracking this before. So not local governments, nobody was really looking at it. So I think maybe that is something that becomes more regular.
Yeah. It's another layer of scrutinization and regulation. And around the country, and again, look, we just come off the back of and then this is moving sideways into other stories, because I know there's a lot of stories that are going to come out this year. And this is one story. But I'd really like to understand from you, like, what you see, and I have my own feeling, like, what are the big stories coming out this year? What are the big elephants in the room that need to be addressed?
You mean, in terms of real estate,
In terms of real estate, yeah, I want to know, what do we expect to be hearing about that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think that, like, obviously, I mean, what, interest rates and the cost of financing affects every segment of the market, right? It affects consumers, it affects developers, commercial, residential. I personally have covered condo buyouts before, and I think that there will be more stories about that. There was a ruling last year in a specific case that affects the way, some developers have done some condo buyouts. So a buyout, for people who don't know, is when unit owners, either band together or developers approach them to sell their building so that it could be torn down and redeveloped, right? I think that as the condo safety law is in effect and some of these deadlines have already started to happen.
Just to be clear, these are the deadlines for the maintenance of these buildings to maintain them up to the regulations that are required to be set.
So to have the financial reserves, or to have the plan in place to have the reserves fully funded, because before you could waive that. So I think that as these budgets get finalized and people are, they have to make a decision, can we afford to maintain this building?
Yeah.
Is there financing for us if we can't afford to do it? Are we going to sell? Is our building even valuable? Is it sitting on valuable land, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, like, buyouts are, have always been a thing here, but I think that there's just more attention on them. And it's coming at a time when it's hard to finance it. So you have developers maybe who are in positions where, they may not be able to close or, so I think there's.
Do you see increased accelerated buyout rates, or do you see decreasing buyout rates?
I don't see an increase. I don't know if it's a decrease, to be honest with you, but I hear about and I report on some of the same buildings because these deals take so long and often there's litigation but they haven't closed yet. So I don't think there's an increase. Are you seeing an increase?
So there is an area that ties in with why these buildings essentially get sold.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that I feel, and again, I'd love your opinion because you're researching this, I feel has to do with the carry costs of these buildings. And one of the biggest costs that we're dealing with is the insurance situation.
Right.
And what we see and what we hear about is old buildings becoming too expensive to maintain, and then insurance compounds because they get even more expensive to maintain.
Right.
And as they get older, they become a higher risk, and therefore the insurance companies hike the rates even up higher. And then it gets to the point where the residents who, in large numbers, because these are older buildings, are retired, because they're retired, they're not making money. They don't have the means to cover these fees, which is, I think, why Chaplin Tower, went through these problems, because they really kicked the can down the street and they didn't want to address the issues. They refused to, under the advice of, I guess, the people who'd come and looked at the building, said, you've got to spend money on this. There are people who can't. And then it's easier, just conceptually easier, for developers to go in and say, okay, we can buy you out now. A higher willingness to sell, rather than, I'm sitting on gold here and I want top dollar, which makes it financially impossible,
right,
or not profitable to buy a building, because buying it becomes too expensive, and then you have to justify construction costs and everything, and then resell. Are you going to be able to sell at the number? But I think as buildings become more untenable for residents, and I see the insurance being the big elephant in the room.
Yeah, insurance is a huge. It affects everybody.
Yeah, across the country.
Yeah.
And we would just do. You're reporting on the California fires.
My colleagues are, yeah.
Yeah, that to me, when we look at what happened on the west coast of Florida, what we see happening in California, the cost for insurance already went up a lot in the last couple of years. Are we going to expect another increase because of this? This will be another.
Well, it's a global issue, so.
Yeah. So globally speaking, this is actually a really interesting point that you raised, because saying the word global makes the suggestion clear that this is not a localized phenomenon. What we're dealing with within the US and within the East Coast, within Miami, Broward, Palm Beach, is not a case of like, well, you've got to be careful over here because there's a problem, which suggests that it's okay here. Systematically, the East Coast to the West Coast, and I was looking at some studies, the process of sinking actually exists on both coasts. And not even in America, it also exists. There's a story of the wheel in Dubai sinking. There's stories of buildings in London, my home city, going through this. And in almost every major city of the world, because you've got superstructures now coming into effect.
Well, look at Manhattan. Yeah, of course, yeah. It's not just Miami. I think Miami, grabs the headlines more.
Yes.
People,
It's almost like frontier conversation, because it's a frontier city, or it feels like a frontier city.
Right.
Like the newest city rising out in the US to become this super metropolis, which is the stories that we see a lot of. And it's easy to see those stories come through because of the announcements of new buildings coming left, right, and center. I know New York's always had them, and other cities have had them, but now more than ever, of course, it's like you pay attention to Miami because of that. But globally speaking, we have things that have to be addressed. And I guess this is something that is not a localized phenomenon. So I think when people are starting to,
yeah, this can be duplicated, and I think it will be duplicated.
Yeah.
This study specifically, in other areas.
And probably, do you imagine it'll get duplicated not just within South Florida, but probably across the country and potentially globally?
I would think like New York. I would think any of these major cities. Yeah.
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 I think it'll be interesting to see how many studies come out over the next couple of years that are based off using this technology and the other technologies that will be spawned from this as people start to pay more attention to it. So going back into the story, you mentioned the buildings. Any other stories that we should, I mean, again, I feel like I'm getting the early information here, so I got to pick your brains as much as I can. Anything else that you're seeing that need to be discussed?
Oh, there's a lot.
Give me a few. Come on.
Well, my colleague covers multifamily, so the rental market. I think that we've already started to see there's distress there. There's because the cost of construction, which is a huge issue, has gone up so much. And so some of those buildings have been converted to condos. So you have buildings that were designed as rentals, potentially being sold as condos. How does that work? Is it successful? Is it not? You have like the lack of affordable housing, which is going to get worse if
population growth and lack of
right, and also the buildings that we're talking about, these older buildings which is not technically, some of them are not technically affordable housing, right, where the rent is like capped or whatever, but it is and I've spoken about this with Anna Bozovic, who you've had on your show.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a form of affordable housing, and so that will start to disappear. So that's going to make the problem even worse.
What happens with that? Just to take people down that rabbit hole. So what happens when that affordable housing starts to dry up?
The people are moving away from the urban core because they can't afford it. I'm sure and so they're driving further, or they're just leaving South Florida altogether. And then you have, more wealthy people coming in. And so it's just creating, I think it creates different issues.
So it's like maybe you would imbalance between the workforce, all levels of the workforce, from the person who is working at the gas station to the person who might be working in the hotel to someone who, is in the restaurant waiting tables or anything else in between, working retail.
Right.
And those people are having a harder time, even teachers. I had an interview with the head of school for Gulliver, and they really look after their teachers. But you've got teachers having to commute an hour.
Right.
And we talk about this. I mean, we've done studies on this, and again, there's a few people that I am close to. There's a few of us really researching. It's interesting. I like having these conversations because I know Anna Bozovic very well, Craig Sudnicki, Eli Braha, who runs FIU School of Real Estate, the Hollow School of Real Estate, professor there. I had David Andolfatto, who's University of Miami, professor of economy. It was interesting to have these conversations because when we look and we're doing these kind of like swapping information, data, it's fascinating to see this shifting pattern and paying attention. And obviously you're chatting with Anna,
right? And
we're getting this data and there's maybe not enough of it.
Right.
Like, do you struggle to get good data? Do you think there's a lack of data production?
There's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of good data out there. I think that like what we do is so specific that sometimes it doesn't exist. So we maybe have to do it, we have to do it ourselves, which obviously takes a long time.
Oh God, that takes and then you've got to scrape it and make it accurate and cross-reference it. I mean,
no data set is ever perfect.
No.
So but there is on the residential front especially, there is a lot of data out there that we can use. I don't really have an issue.
There's a lot of creative stuff now because of cross-referencing data with that one data set to another. And now with AI, we can do a lot of that. So we can say, all right, please draw parallels between these 5 different index data points. And then it'll say, hey, these are some of the potential results.
And then do you check that? I'm curious. Or do you just use it?
We do. I mean, what I always have is a conversation because I am not the analyst who's running the numbers. I'm pulling the numbers, I'm getting it. But what it does is it allows me for the observation of human behavior. Because what I do as an economist and as a demographer, I look at what the data says, and then I pay heavy attention to what I'm hearing on the street. And we all know that human psychology is a big influencing force with what happens. If everyone over here believes A to be true, then something will happen. Even if A isn't correct, even if A is false, it just needs enough people to believe it's true to initiate some change or some action. So, I feel that this is something that helps me understand changing behaviors. And very often when I'll pull in data and I'll hear about these stories, I'll start to, like, I'm sure you will too, you'll suddenly have these aha moments when you see the pins drop and you go, oh, I get it, I see. That correlates with that, and that correlates with that, and okay, that makes sense. So this is all I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm just trying to find my way through the process to make sense of things. I wanted to get into, and this is a big thing because it's your sector, your industry, your profession, journalism as a whole, journalism as the business as it is today. And you've done this for 10 years. So journalism's changed, no doubt. What are you seeing and how do you deal with it?
I mean, there's a lot more out there. There's a lot more, the way our information is consumed is different, right? Like, do people come straight to the website? Do they read the articles, or are they watching us talk about it on a YouTube channel? Like, are they looking at the Instagram reel? That's one thing that's changed. I also think, like, this is beyond journalism. There's just so much more out there, that there's so much more happening. There's so much more, I know that, like, my job has changed in the sense that, like, I had 1 or 2 stories to do a day 10 years ago, and now I'm juggling so much more, and it feels like it's a lot more serious. And maybe that's because I was starting out in my career, but that's kind of like, it's interesting to kind of see what we were doing before and how much more we're doing now, and how we're prioritizing different things in terms of what we cover and how we get it out, right? So, I mean, we have a podcast that The Real Deal does. We have a YouTube channel. We didn't have that 10 years ago.
When did that start for you guys?
I should know this off the top of my head. The podcast was probably a few years ago, and it's doing very well. But I mean, our Instagram account, like, it's huge, and the reach we have there is.
What is your reach now on Instagram?
So we have 400,000. Yeah.
Yeah, you got 401,000 followers
just on Instagram, right?
Okay, and
And,
exactly.
We have posts that get obviously like millions of impressions and things like that. But I mean, we're also people are able to access us that way, which I think is good, because we can get messages in our DMs. We, they find us on LinkedIn. Like, it's just the way we get tips has.
Do stories come to you? I mean, I obviously, if you get a story, how do these stories manifest themselves?
I mean, it's everything. It's people call me out of the blue all the time.
What's the craziest story that you had when someone just called you out of the blue? Because I'm always curious. I'd love to be like, I'll have a camera in your office figuring out. I've got an image of what a media office would look and feel like.
I mean, I could tell you that I got a call last summer, that Sergio Pino had died. And Sergio Pino was a developer in South Florida who was being investigated by the FBI.
Yes. Yeah, I remember the story.
Right. And so I was at the airport, not working that day. And that was pretty crazy. I was about to board a flight. So the FBI had been at his house, and he, died by.
So did you get on the plane?
Well,
or did you have to, like, run with your laptop somewhere?
Like a friend's moment. So one of my colleagues, Francisco Alvarado, had also been covering that. So we teamed up on that, and he was obviously not on a plane. Yeah.
So he helped you out, started to put stuff together, and then you write the story. You kind of like have to make calls. I'm assuming you start to fact check and research and know what really happened to make sure it wasn't like, the celebrities say, I heard I died yesterday on social media, and it's like, no, I'm still here.
Right.
But you check all of that, and then obviously the circumstances and how that happened. When you get these, obviously that came to you.
Now, I did not break that story, but yes.
But it was brought to you, and then you realized, okay, I've got to cover it. Have you seen stories that you guys have covered, and suddenly it takes on a whole other? You're familiar with the term newsjacking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember I learned this years ago, and it was in a marketing event. And my background was marketing. I used to be the director of marketing for IMG, the sports agency, like way, way back. And I learnt this term newsjacking, which I'd never heard from before. And the term newsjacking, for those who don't know, is when you cover a story and then somebody else covers the story so quickly after you've covered it that they manage to segue themselves into the story. It's almost like it's an extrapolation of your story, and they almost get their source to become the story. They reference you, and And then it takes on a life of its own.
Right.
You must have seen that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely.
And when you get that, do you ever read stuff and go, well, that's just not right. That's just not even like close to being what was, reported.
I guess that happens. I mean, I think when it's a reputable, like when it's a news organization, normally, like, obviously not every story is perfect, right? But I think it is interesting to see, how sometimes these articles from different publications can be very similar. And I believe that part of it is that maybe they've read the original story, right?
Yeah.
But also part of it is that that's just the way it would be told. So these are the experts that you would reach out to. You know what I mean? So there is some of that. But yeah, I mean, for sure. And there's so much crazy news that happens here that you're going to attract the Vanity Fairs and you know what I mean?
Yeah. Look, people, it's kind of like, the term car crash TV. Right, where people watch something on TV, and it was like it started. When I remember seeing, I think it was like the Jerry Springer. There was like documentary on Jerry Springer, where people want to watch people implode on national TV, and they want to hear salacious, crazy, gasp stories because it fills their day and makes them feel a little less crappy about themselves. So they'll read these stories, and the worse it is, the more horrifying it is, the more they want to read it.
Yeah, any tragic story, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's a point where you kind of go, where does it go from responsible journalism to propaganda to fluff? I mean, it goes from being factual to just being salacious gossip. And you start to read stuff out there. I saw stuff all the time, especially YouTube. I mean, you've got a YouTube channel now. You're following on YouTube. I'm sure you get lots and lots of views from those right. videos.
Yeah.
Because people like to digest that information. Yeah. But it's completely unregulated. Like YouTube as a space, it's unregulated.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, it's interesting because I think for a while I was or maybe real estate, what we do is a little bit shielded from that because it was more about like the business and like, home sales and
it's less offensive stuff.
Yeah.
But even
now it's really become, it's become more mainstream.
Yeah.
And even in like South Florida, I think so many people read The Real Deal because real estate drives our economy is one of the main.
Well, it's a human story. Usually behind every real estate thing,
right,
deal, whatever,
yeah, and
there's a human story, especially when you've got big characters.
Yeah, because buildings don't do things. The people who own the buildings do things,
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting. And it's also interesting to see like just these like crime, what do you call them? I mean, YouTubers and like
I don't know, clickbait trolls half the time. I mean, I don't. So,
but I don't really have time to. I don't really have time to pay attention to
it. But the worrying thing is that this stuff can be dangerous. This stuff can be dangerous in the perception within the public eye because I hear this all the time. I hear stories come out, and being in real estate. And being relatively prominent in the media section of real estate because I produce the podcast and I write lots of articles and, I try to keep myself on the front of these things. I read something and I just go, that's just not even true. That's not even close to being true. It's misquoted. Anna, who Anna got massively misquoted, she says, by a New York paper who didn't fact check, who took information from another story, just extrapolated it, put it out there, and then they went to interview her, and she said she wasn't available for the interview, but they ran with the story anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Then she called the editor and said, you completely misquoted me. You misquoted me. Not only did you misquote me, but you also took data that wasn't even accurate. And that, I mean, I know that there has to be an accountability. I'm assuming with The Real Deal, because you're a major news source, you are held to a level of accountability. Like you can't make up a story because if you do, you get sued. Right,
but also that's wrong. But yeah,
it's also wrong. Of course, look, the reason you shouldn't do it is because it's morally abhorrent and wrong. But there's also a consequence to this, professionally speaking. But yeah, first and foremost, it's wrong.
Right.
Let's just be like, we hope that we can look ourselves in the mirror each morning and saying, yeah, I'm not a complete lying bag of, whatever. But there is with The Real Deal. If you produced a story that wasn't accurate, what would happen? You'd get sued, I'm assuming,
right?
Or you can get fined. I mean, again, there's things in place within the journalistic world that holds news sources accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I hear that because sometimes they'll just issue an apology. I mean, that happens usually within the what I call the gossip media. So if you go to California, and I'm talking about the TMZs, if somebody says something about a celebrity having Botox that's not true, or
Right.
fathering someone's kid that wasn't true,
Right.
they'll just go, "Oh, I'm sorry, we made a mistake."
Yeah.
But they've already sold the magazine. They've already got the story out.
Right.
They've already sold the magazines and the papers, and they've already got the press coverage.
Right.
So who loses?
Yeah, I mean, it's very obviously like, in journalism school, I remember like misspelling somebody's name was a fact error, which would mean that you got 50%. You basically failed something. So it's like it's very serious for us, and we take it very seriously. And when there is a correction that has to be run, we do it carefully. But it's there's also some human error that's going to happen in anything,
Sure.
that's not intentional or anything like that. But you just have to be a thorough researcher. You have to, check things with your sources. You have to be careful in like what the point of the story is and make sure that that's coming across, so it's just, I think people are quick to call out, journalists when they make a mistake or something like that. But it is, at least for me, like it's something that I take very seriously. So it's not like it's never an intentional thing, know?
You take it, I'm going to say, to the point of the Hippocratic Oath, if you're a doctor, of do no harm. But there is a do no harm within the world of journalism where when you're writing, you've got to be accurate in what you're producing, which is great. I guess the fall from grace, if you don't, is so severe because what we see right now is news sources that lose complete credibility amongst their audience because they say one thing that's a lie or say a couple of things that are a lie. And then suddenly no one believes anything that they say. And then now you've got a problem. But that layer below you going into the other levels of journalism, well, it's not journalism, but let's call the problem that we have is what I would call clickbait media. Which is how many clicks you can get. That's how I judge the success of what I'm doing. Story be damned. If I can, there's a newspaper in England, and it was like the National Enquirer, right? And it would have stories like Princess Diana ate my hamster, just absolute nonsense. You'd read it and you'd laugh at it because it's just completely nuts. Yeah. But we have an issue with these kind of stories that come up. But now, like you said on YouTube, people can say whatever they like. They can say anything that they want.
But they always could. It's just there's another medium out there, where people can listen and watch.
Yeah.
But people always talked. There was always that element.
And then that's then you get the Chinese whispers.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, what do you read every day? What do you look to? Are you reading the full story? I think everybody's very busy too, so it's like you have a limited attention span. But what we try to do is be as concise as possible so that people get the information that they need, and they don't have to read, a 2,000-word story to get it.
Yeah, I mean, I find with articles sometimes people are reading less unless the editor of the Herald said to me, look, it's almost like people don't want to read. They don't want to read a white paper anymore. They don't want to read a 30 pages research. I mean, this research for this article for the buildings, it's 20 pages, right? And it's not light reading.
No.
Right? You're going to want to read this.
Yeah.
But I think in order for you to make a comment on this, if you have an opinion, or if you want to have a conversation about, my building, what's going on with it? Should I do something about it? Should I be concerned? Should I not? Should I buy a new condo in Miami or should I not? Just do yourself the favor, first of all, people, and read this. Just read it. Don't read the articles first. Read the piece, and then obviously start to piece it together. Because I think that to me is like, a large part of this. I'm just wondering now with everything moving forward, how you see journalism moving through the next couple of years. What do you see growing right now within your arena? Like you've obviously mentioned, you've got the Instagram, you've got YouTube, you've obviously got the magazine is still being published. Yeah, you still got it as in like hard paper copy, and then obviously online. What is it? Where are eyeballs right now?
I mean, they're everywhere. Like, it depends on the story. It depends on what people are.
Is there a particular medium that's growing more than the others that you're suddenly seeing there's more of an uptick in one area?
I should know the answer to that. I would say, like, definitely, our social media growth has been huge, huge.
So as in like your Instagram and
Yeah, and LinkedIn has done very well too. And our podcast has done really well. I think that, like, we and our events. I mean, people at the end of the day, even though you have all of these like online, you know, mediums, like, they want to come to our events and they want to see you face to face and they want to
yeah, the Real Deal holds an event every year.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, I'm sure most people do, but every year is it December time? November. Yeah, and it's end of the year.
Yeah.
And you do an event every year and you basically bring everyone together and you bring developers together and you bring real estate brokerages and you bring all the kind of like the people who are developing tools, whatever they might be, together to this like big event space. And then it's a 3-day event, is it? 3-day event?
2 days.
2-day event.
Yeah.
2-day event.
Yeah, and we have events in our other markets too. But, but our South Florida event is the biggest one. Yeah.
So South Florida market's the biggest one
For the event, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is great because it brings a chance for people to communicate one-on-one, like the direct person to person, which no doubt absolutely helps. I don't know if I was going to bring the conversation up because I'm kind of don't know whether it's right or wrong to do it, but the whole story with the fires in California, how does that get processed right now? Because you guys are reporting on that as well,
right?
And how do you cover that story? Are you just
Yeah, I mean,
in the land?
Yeah, I'm personally not covering it because I'm here.
Yeah.
I mean, from the South Florida perspective, like, we are starting to hear about wealthy people who want to maybe rent here for, rent or potentially even buy.
I already had the phone calls. They started a few days ago for me because I'm a Douglas Elliman.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think there's some of that, but there is, when something like that of that size happens, our jobs shift a little. So, like, for example, with the collapse, like when the building collapsed here, like we were reporting on that, and it was a breaking news story. It became it became more of like a general news publication in that sense, where you're covering things that maybe.
Well, when these stories happen,
yeah,
like the Chaplin Tower collapse, like the fire, these are like major tragedies, hurricanes. These are huge stories with massive amount of life loss and impact. And I guess one of the things that happen, I mean, fear mongering, and it's not fear mongering, that's not even right to say that, but the fear that's created and the concern that's created from the reality of these situations has a huge gravity, has a huge pull on what people, and I'm sure people are trying to figure out, what the hell am I going to do? Yeah. Am I going to stay? Am I going to go? Am I going to rebuild? Am I not going to rebuild? Is it possible to rebuild? How long is it going to take to rebuild? Yeah. Is the infrastructure capable of rebuilding? Is the money there to rebuild? Will the money come down from the insurance companies to rebuild? Or will I be better off somewhere else? What do I do?
And we also, like, unlike a general news publication, like, we are talking to brokers who have lost their homes. I mean, it's like,
I have a family member who lost their home. I have many friends who are real estate agents who lost their homes, who have clients who lost their homes. It's a really hard conversation to have. And you don't want to be ambulance chasing, and you don't want to be profiteering or reporting on people's misery, because that's just wrong.
No, not at all. No, it's about getting accurate information out there.
But also these people need help and assistance. And I know with a story, one of my family members, they felt really touched because they lost their house and they're in the supermarket and they were trying to buy food and groceries. And the girl at the checkout said, "I'm not going to charge you. It's on me. The food's on me." And all these people were helping. They were bringing food to them saying, no, take this. Yeah. Let me help you. There was this real outpouring of emotion. It's very it kind of chokes you up. But it's really hard to process this kind of stuff. And I think people have a really hard time because it's really almost so surreal that people can't really even imagine what life's going to be like many months from now. No, they can't even imagine tomorrow or next week, never mind many months from now. So we try to, again, I know the David Siddons group, we've reached out to many people and said, look, if you need our help, whatever it is, I'm not here to try and sell you a home or get you a rental, but whatever it is you need,
Right.
whatever information you need, whatever I can do to help, just ask, and I'll do everything I can within my power to help you. I guess so conclusively, and I wrote some notes conclusively, and I feel like this is like a sign off. I didn't want to get caught up in conversations of entrapment journalism. I get called all the time for articles and reports, and I always try to be accurate. But I really wanted to have a conversation that was fair, appreciated the legitimate headlines from a good source, that appreciating can become and has become Chinese whispers, but to find its way through social media and the internet gets turned into propaganda very quickly. But wanted to make sure that as people read your article and read the follow-up articles, that they do more than read the headline.
Yes, please.
I think I think I'd love to hear from you. I'm sure you probably want to feel there is a responsibility that ultimately does not lie on the shoulders purely of the media. It does not lie purely on the shoulders of anybody else apart from the person that decides to read the article and read the information and process it effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be an educated resident
of
your community. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I've always felt like this. I don't expect everyone to watch my podcast and agree with it and like it. I do welcome healthy conversation. I do expect you to be thoughtful and ask intelligent questions. And if you don't want to, if you want to make outlandish comments below this blog, below this video, which will be on YouTube, and make comments like, this is all BS, blah, blah, just troll your way into some cave somewhere. Don't make comments because it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't serve any greater good. All it does is it lowers us to the lowest denominator, which right now feels like it's getting pretty goddamn low sometimes. So I appreciate that we're going to see more research on this. I appreciate that we are looking at, new charted area. I will be talking to Kobe Karp next week because I get to hear a perspective from him. I welcome anybody out there who is a civil engineer, safety engineer, specializes in oil samples, specializes in geology, understands rock formations and how sand moves, anything like that. Give me a call. I'd love to hear. I'm just curious to know, about this. And then obviously, understanding sea level rise, insurance, the old condos, like where these stories go through next year. What are we looking forward to? Socioeconomic, political, environmental. I hope that we'll keep talking. I'll definitely be calling you and bugging you, trying to get a little, leg up on any good stories coming out. I know that you, sincerely, I can see that you are writing and aiming to write in a responsible manner. I understand you're also held within the realities of the journalistic world and the world that we live in, which is that we need to get people's attention in order for them to read. And that's okay. That happens. I mean, if you wrote a really, like we joked online before we even started this, that if you wrote a really long, more descriptive, variable answer of what the article was about, it wouldn't have the same impact and people wouldn't read it.
They wouldn't understand it, yeah.
And they wouldn't understand it. So read the entire story. I think that's all we say. Thank you for doing this. I don't know if you have any more questions for me, but this has been enlightening. And thank you for watching, and I hope you stay tuned for another David Siddons video coming soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.